Good evening, and welcome to News of the World. It's Saturday, August 22nd. Tonight we drift slowly across 28 countries, from Italy to Estonia. There's nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Settle in and let the world turn. In Italy, something unexpected has been quietly taking root. A renewed fascination with Yiddish literature, and with it, a language and a world that many Italians may never have encountered before. It is being called a Yiddish moment, and it seems to be real. Publishers, readers, and translators are all part of it. At the heart of this wave is a new and unprecedented Italian translation of work by I.J. Singer. The older brother of the more widely known Nobel laureate Isaac Bashevis Singer, Israel Joshua Singer wrote in a different register than his brother, broader canvases, often more political, rooted in the vanished Jewish life of Eastern Europe. For decades, his work was largely absent from Italian bookshelves. That absence is now being corrected. The translation is part of a wider boom, a surge of interest that has brought Yiddish stories, poetry, and history to Italian readers in a way that feels less like nostalgia and more like discovery. There's something fitting about this. Italy has its own long, complex Jewish history, communities in Rome, Venice, Ferrara, and elsewhere that stretch back centuries. Yiddish, though, belongs to a different landscape, one of shtetls and crowded cities far to the east. That Italians are now reaching toward that world, through translation, suggests a curiosity that crosses borders not of geography, but of memory. If you're still with me, consider what it means when a language once thought to be fading finds new readers in a country where it was never spoken. It does not return to where it was. It arrives somewhere new, and in Italy these days it seems to have found a welcome. In Kenya, a helicopter went down in a part of the country known for its sweeping savanna and the luxury safaris that draw visitors from around the world. 7 people were killed, 5 were Americans, 1 was an Ecuadorian official. Among them was a restaurateur from Miami and 2 men remembered as husbands from South Florida, people whose lives were rooted in communities an ocean away. The details of what caused the crash haven't been shared yet, and the investigation will take time. What's known is that these were people who had traveled a great distance to see one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth, and that their journey ended there, far from everything familiar. Kenya's parks and reserves are places of deep stillness, wide horizons, animals moving in their ancient rhythms, light that seems to belong to no one. They draw people who want to stand close to something vast and unscripted, that lives where lost in such a place gives the grief a particular weight. The beauty of the land doesn't soften the loss, and it shouldn't have to. If you're still with me, hold a thought for the families waiting for word, and for the communities, Kenyan and beyond, who are absorbing this. The land will go on being what it always has been, but 7 people won't be going home from it. Thailand, long known for its busy streets and full factories, may have already reached a quiet turning point. Researchers tracking global population trends suggest the number of people living here has stopped growing, that the country's population may have peaked, perhaps sooner than expected. It's the kind of change that doesn't announce itself. No single day marks it. You won't find crowds in the streets or flags raised. But somewhere in the past few years, the line on the chart flattened, and may now be beginning its slow descent. Families have been getting smaller for a long time. Birth rates fell as cities grew, as women joined the workforce in greater numbers, as the cost of raising children climbed. It's a story familiar across East Asia. Japan and South Korea have been walking this road for years, but Thailand arriving at the same threshold carries its own weight. This is a country that built much of its modern economy on manufacturing, on young hands assembling goods for the world. And so the question that follows is not just about population, but about what comes next. Economists and policy thinkers have been urging Thailand to reinvent its growth model, to move from assembly lines toward technology, toward artificial intelligence, toward the kind of economy that doesn't depend on an ever-growing workforce. None of that is simple, and none of it happens overnight. But if you're still with me, just hold the image for a moment. A country standing still, in the gentlest sense, looking ahead at a future that will look different from its past. It's not a crisis, it's a doorway. Antigua and Barbuda has been quietly turning its attention to the question of what arrives on its shores and what shouldn't. The government has outlined new initiatives aimed at improving law and order, a phrase that can mean many things, but here it seems to begin with the ports. Plans are underway to secure X-ray machines capable of scanning incoming cargo for illegal weapons. It's a practical step, the kind that doesn't make much noise but changes what's possible at the point where a small island meets the rest of the world. Behind that measured response lies something more restless. Protesters recently gathered to demand justice for someone named Rashan, taking their calls to a place known locally as 1735. The details beyond that are scarce, but the presence of people in the street tells its own story, that for some, the question of safety isn't abstract, it's personal. And so the two threads run alongside each other, the government building out its tools and a community asking that those tools be used in service of something fair. If you're still with me, you might picture it the way these things often look in small nations. A handful of officials weighing policy in a quiet room, and not far away, voices outside carrying a name they don't want forgotten. Neither side is finished. Both are still speaking, and the night holds room for all of it. Greece has long been a country where people look outward, across the sea, toward horizons this week. That habit of looking outward took on a new shape, somewhere between industry and geography. An American company called AeroVironment, known for building uncrewed aircraft, announced it would form a joint venture based in Greece. The plan, as described in trade publications, is to develop uncrewed aerial systems and counter-drone technology, the business of flying machines that carry no pilot, and the business of defending against them. For Greece, the venture represents something more than a corporate footnote. It places a piece of a growing, contested industry inside the country, inside a nation that sits at the crossroads of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Aegean. The specifics of the partnership remain limited in public reporting, but the broad outline is clear enough. A company seeking a European foothold and a country offering one. There's a quiet logic to it. Greece has spent recent years deepening its defense relationships and investing in its own technological capacity. A venture like this doesn't make headlines the way a crisis does, but it settles into the landscape, a factory floor, a research office, a handful of engineers at work. Whether it grows into something lasting or remains a modest beginning, it marks a small shift in how Greece positions itself in a world where the sky is increasingly crowded with machines that fly themselves. And for now, that's where the story rests. Eswatini, the small landlocked kingdom tucked between South Africa and Mozambique, has signed a health funding agreement with the United States worth nearly $200 million. It is a significant commitment for a country of roughly 1.5 million people, where health services have long carried a heavy burden, particularly from HIV and tuberculosis, which have shaped daily life for generations. The details of the agreement are still emerging, but the scale alone tells you something. For a nation where many rural communities rely on clinics reachable only by long walks or uncertain roads, health funding at this level is not abstract. It reaches into villages, into waiting rooms, into the quiet work of nurses and community health workers who have held things together through years of strain. Eswatini is Africa's last remaining absolute monarchy, and its international partnerships often move through channels that outsiders find hard to read. But a health agreement of this size, backed by the United States, suggests a sustained vote of confidence in the country's medical infrastructure, or at least in its potential. If you're still with me, Consider what it means for a small country to appear on a large donor's radar in this way. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones where money moves quietly toward people who need it, and the work of caring for a population gets a little more breathing room. Tonight, in the hills and valleys of Eswatini, that possibility settles in, steady, practical, and quietly hopeful. Mongolia has been thinking about land lately, about what it means when the ground beneath you starts to slip away. This week, the country inaugurated COP17, the United Nations Summit on Desertification, and used the moment to ask for something deceptively simple: concrete action to restore the land. Not pledges, not frameworks, action. It's a request that carries particular weight coming from here, because Mongolia has been living with the problem in a way most of the world has not. Drought has been deepening across its vast steppes and grasslands, turning pasture into dust and pushing herders into harder choices every season. The land isn't some abstract policy concern. It's where people graze their animals, raise their children, and carry forward traditions that stretch back centuries. So when Mongolia stands up at a UN podium and says the world needs to do more, it's not a diplomatic gesture, it's a country speaking from experience, and it's not entirely alone in the effort. China has been stepping up to help Mongolia fight the encroaching desert, a reminder that dust and wind don't stop at borders. There's something quietly hopeful in all of this, even amid the worry. A country facing down a slow, patient crisis chooses to gather the world's attention and ask for something real. The steppes have seen worse than conferences, of course, but they've also seen what happens when nobody listens. If you're still with me, hold that thought: the land and the people who won't let it go quietly. Malta sits in the middle of the Mediterranean like a stone step between two worlds, and these days that step feels unusually firm. The ratings agency Fitch has affirmed the island nation's credit rating at A+, with a stable outlook, pointing to a strong growth outlook as the reason. It's the kind of news that doesn't make headlines in the loud sense, but it tells you something quiet and worth knowing. A small country, fewer than 500,000 people, being told by international observers that its economic footing is solid and that the path ahead looks steady rather than uncertain. Malta's economy has long been shaped by its geography. Tourism, financial services, maritime trade, and increasingly technology all flow through this crossroads. An A+ rating is not a celebration or a rescue. It's more like a nod from across the room, an acknowledgement that the foundations are holding, that growth isn't accidental, that the work being done is being noticed beyond the island's own shores. The stable outlook means Fitch doesn't see storm clouds gathering on the immediate horizon. No dramatic upgrade, no warning of trouble. Just a calm, measured confidence. And for a country that has spent centuries absorbing the pressures of empires and trade routes and war and now peace, that kind of quiet confidence may be the most welcome sound of all. If you're still with me, we'll let Malta rest there for tonight, steady, small, and sure of itself. Yemen sits at the southern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, a place where the land narrows between mountains and sea, and where people have lived through a conflict that never quite ended. These days, the headlines suggest it is sliding back toward full-scale war. Government forces and Houthi fighters have been trading attacks. A port called Mocha on the Red Sea coast has been crippled by the strikes. Landmines still lie hidden in the ground, threatening civilians long after the fighting moves on. It is, by any measure, a difficult moment. And yet someone from the International Rescue Committee recently traveled to southern Yemen and came back with reflections. Not a policy paper, not a battlefield update, but something quieter. We don't have the full text of what they saw, but the fact that they went, that they walked through communities in the south and came back wanting to tell people about it, tells you something. It tells you that behind the talk of escalation and alliances and maritime coalitions, there are still people there. Families deciding whether to stay or to move, aid workers trying to reach them. A country that has been called the world's worst humanitarian crisis and is now watching the fragile quiet it had break apart again. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. Not the map with its arrows and front lines, but the south of Yemen, where someone visited recently and thought the rest of us should know. In the United Arab Emirates these days, a quiet conversation is unfolding. Not about how fast technology can move, but about what it might leave behind. The country has embraced artificial intelligence with a boldness few places can match, weaving it into government services, education, and the rhythms of daily life. But alongside that momentum, there's a parallel concern taking shape, one that sounds almost old-fashioned against the hum of progress. People are asking what happens to family life, to the bonds between parents and children, to the time spent together when machines grow smarter and the pace of everything quickens. It is a question being explored in community gatherings and faith circles, among them the Baha'i community, which has been reflecting on how to keep the warmth of family at the center of a changing world. The thinking is not that technology should be feared or rejected, it is more subtle than that. The idea is that families themselves need to be nurtured, tended like a garden, so that they remain a place where values are passed down, where children learn kindness and patience, where conversation still matters more than a screen. In a country that has built itself upward at extraordinary speed, this is a gentler kind of ambition. Not a race to the next frontier, but a steady attention to the people who will walk across it together. And perhaps that is the real measure of progress, not what a society can build, but what it refuses to let go of along the way. Jamaica has long been known for the things it gives the world through its people. Music, food, a way of speaking that carries warmth across oceans. These days, it is also stepping into a conversation that has mostly belonged to much larger places. A platform called OpenJM has been launched, and it is being described as the Caribbean's first memory-centric multimodal agentic platform. That is a mouthful, and the details are still emerging. But what it means in plain terms is that someone in Jamaica is building artificial intelligence tools designed to remember, to work across different kinds of input, and to act on behalf of the person using it, not as a copy of what exists elsewhere, but as something rooted here. The name itself, OpenJM, carries the country's initials, and that feels deliberate in a region often thought of as a place technology arrives rather than a place it begins that matters. There's not much more to tell yet. The announcement is fresh, and the full shape of the project will reveal itself in time. But if you're still with me, you might sit with this for a moment. A small island, looking ahead, building something of its own. Not shouting about it, just beginning. And somewhere in the Caribbean night, a few people are writing code that speaks in a new voice, one that sounds perhaps a little like home. Argentina's national team has been handed a round of suspensions and a fine from FIFA, following a scuffle that broke out after the World Cup final against Spain. The match itself had ended in defeat for Argentina, and what happened afterward, a brawl involving players and staff, has now been reviewed and punished by football's governing body. The sanctions are significant. Leandro Paredes, the midfielder many will know from his years in European football, received the heaviest individual penalty, a 10-match ban. In all, 4 players and 1 team official were suspended, with the combined total reaching 21 matches. The Argentine Football Association was fined as well. For a country where football runs deep, where a World Cup final is not just a sporting event, but something woven into the national mood, this lands with a particular kind of weight. The loss to Spain was already a difficult moment. What followed turned a hard night into something messier, and now the consequences stretch into the matches ahead. FIFA's decisions are rarely quick to be overturned, and these suspensions will shape Argentina's roster for some time. There will be frustration, surely, and debate over whether the punishment fits the incident. But there will also be, as there always is in Argentine football, a turning of the page, a next match, a next chance, the slow work of rebuilding after a moment that got away from everyone. If you're still with me, that's the story from Argentina tonight. Mozambique has set itself a quiet, ambitious task to bring internet connection to 300 rural localities across the country. It's the kind of plan that doesn't make much noise in the wider world, but if you think about what it means on the ground, it's enormous. These are places where a phone signal can be a day's walk away, where a clinic might keep its records on paper not by choice but by necessity, where a farmer hears the price of cassava from a neighbor who heard it from a truck driver who passed through 3 days ago. To string a connection out to 300 of them, that's schools, that's health posts, that's families speaking to each other across distances that have always felt longer than kilometers. The government hasn't said yet how quickly it'll happen or exactly which localities come first, and those details will matter when they come. But the intention itself says something worth noticing, that the people in these communities aren't being thought of as an afterthought. They're being written into the country's future, not left to wait for it to arrive on its own. And if you've ever been somewhere with no signal, you'll know the particular feeling of that silence lifting. Not just information arriving, but presence, connection. The sense that the rest of the world knows you're there, and you know it too. Somewhere in Mozambique, in a village whose name most of us will never learn, a line is being planned. And when it lights up, something small and steady will have changed. In Ukraine these days, an ordinary trip to a shopping center can become something you survive rather than something you remember. A Russian drone struck a busy mall, and then, as people gathered to help the wounded, a second strike came. 15 people lost their lives. More than 100 were injured. The details are spare, and they are enough. A place meant for errands and small daily choices became a place of grief, and the families who were waiting for someone to come home are still waiting. I won't rush past that, but I want to tell you what happened next, or rather, what keeps happening. World Central Kitchen, the relief organization founded by the chef Jose Andres, has now served more than 300 million meals in Ukraine. That number is so large it almost refuses to mean anything. So think of it this way: 300 million times, someone stood over a stove, portioned food into a container, and handed it to someone who needed it. The organization says Ukraine's own strength is what makes the work possible. The local cooks, the drivers, the volunteers who know which road is safe this week and which one isn't. They feed people in shelters, in damaged neighborhoods, in towns where the grocery store no longer exists. The meals don't undo what was lost at that mall. Nothing does that, but they sit beside the loss, warm and steady. A small proof that the day still holds something you can hold in both hands. If you're still with me, that's where Ukraine is tonight, grieving and feeding one another in the same breath. Zambia held an election recently, and the voting itself, by many accounts, went quietly. People lined up, cast their ballots, and went home. It was what came after that tested the country. The result was decisive. The government held firm, but the way power was exercised in the days that followed left many wondering what kind of democracy Zambia is becoming. Security forces raided opposition figures' homes. In one of those raids, a former minister, Mutotwe Kafwaya, was shot and killed. His death has drawn calls from human rights groups for a proper investigation and an end to the crackdown. The opposition candidate has challenged the results, pointing to that deadly raid and to broader concerns about how the count was handled. International observers, including the European Union, raised questions about the counting process even though the polling day itself had been peaceful. Commentators have described the election as messy, strong on one side of the ledger, weakened on the other. And yet, alongside the alarm, there are voices in Zambia asking for something quieter and more durable. Bishop Kalumba, a Catholic leader in the country, has spoken about servant leadership, the idea that those who govern should see themselves as answerable to the people, not above them. It is an old idea and a simple one, but in a week like this, it carries a particular weight. Zambia is not in crisis, exactly, but it is asking itself a hard question out loud about what strength in government should look like and what it should never cost. Australia has long carried a particular relationship with gun control, one shaped by hard experience and by the decisions that followed. This week, that conversation has returned. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced that the nation's capital, Canberra, will join a gun buyback program, a response to the attack at Bondi Beach that shook so many people earlier this year. The details of what happened at Bondi are still painful to hold, and I won't try to compress them here. What matters tonight is that something was broken and a country is deciding what to do about it. A buyback is a simple idea, really. You ask people to bring forward firearms they no longer want or need, and you offer something in return, usually money, sometimes just the quiet satisfaction of handing something over. It's not a single dramatic gesture, it's slower than that, more patient. Australia has tried this before, and the country has generally found that patience worthwhile. What's notable is that Canberra is joining something already underway elsewhere. This isn't a national decree from the top, but a capital choosing to step in line with a wider effort. There will be debate, of course, there always is. But for now, a government is asking its citizens to trust that fewer weapons in circulation means more safety for everyone. And in a place like Australia, where the memory of past violence has shaped law before, that question carries a particular weight. If you're still with me, we'll move on now gently to the next place on the map. Syria has spent years on the outside of nearly every room where the world's decisions get made. Now something is shifting, and slowly the doors are cracking open. The United States is preparing to lift Syria's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, a label that has shadowed the country for decades, cutting it off from banks, trade, and the ordinary machinery of international life. It's not a single gesture around it. Other movements are happening. Syria has asked to join an international partnership against chemical weapons. Nuclear inspectors and Syrian officials are moving toward a safeguards resolution. There was even a visit to Damascus by a foreign head of state, something that would have been unthinkable not long ago. And the sounds of explosions in the city during that visit were a reminder that the old Syria has not entirely gone quiet. Meanwhile, Syria is weighing whether to join a defense arrangement shaped by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, while signaling it may step back from renewing its old ties with Iran. Israel has watched all of this with visible unease, warning Turkey against what it calls dangerous adventures in Syrian territory. And beneath the politics, something else is surfacing. A tunnel in Ghouta, once a shelter during siege, now a museum. Syrian art traveling from Palmyra to Venice, a country trying to tell its own story again, in its own voice. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. A nation not yet at peace, but no longer entirely alone. Uruguay doesn't always make the loudest headlines, but it has a way of getting on with things while no one's really watching. These days, that's especially true when it comes to cars. According to Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, Uruguay is quietly leading South America in the adoption of electric vehicles, and the reason, as so often with Uruguay, is practical rather than dramatic. The government has put tax incentives in place that make it genuinely easier for people to choose an electric car over a conventional one. Not a sweeping revolution announced with fanfare, but a steady, measured nudge, the kind of policy that works because it meets people where they are. For a country of around 3.5 million, sandwiched between Brazil and Argentina, both far larger and far louder, that matters. Uruguay has built a reputation over the years for doing things its own way. Stable institutions, sensible energy policy, a power grid that already runs largely on wind and water. So it makes a kind of sense that electric vehicles would find their footing here sooner than elsewhere on the continent. The roads are quieter for it, the air a little cleaner, and the transition, by all accounts, is unfolding without much fuss. If you're still with me, it's worth sitting with that for a moment, a small country choosing its future carefully, one car at a time, and not feeling the need to tell the whole world about it. Some stories travel best in a whisper. Costa Rica is thinking again about how its travelers move through the sky. The country's main international gateway, Juan Santa Maria, has long handled both overseas arrivals and the smaller domestic routes that connect San Jose to places along the coasts and the forests. Now there's a plan to move those internal flights elsewhere, to ease the pressure on an airport that has grown busier than it was built to be. It's the kind of decision that sounds small on paper, but it touches a lot of journeys. Costa Rica is a country where you can drive from one coast to another in a single long afternoon. And yet the little domestic airlines still matter, especially for people reaching remote towns or tight schedules. Moving them to a different airfield would change the rhythm of how people arrive and depart. It would also free up room at Juan Santa Maria for the international traffic that keeps the country connected to the rest of the world. If you've ever been through that airport, you may remember the green hills just beyond the runway, the sense that you're already nearly in the countryside even before you leave the terminal. That balance between welcoming the world and keeping things manageable at home is one a lot of places struggle with. Costa Rica seems to be approaching it the way it approaches most things, steadily, without hurry, and with an eye on what comes next, and so the conversation continues quietly among the people who keep the planes moving. Vietnam has been quietly working on something that touches every street, every intersection, every breath taken on a motorbike in morning traffic across its cities. The idea of low-emission zones is beginning to take hold, areas where older, higher-polluting vehicles are gently discouraged and where cleaner alternatives are given room to grow. It is part of a broader shift the country has been making toward greener transport, and it comes from a very real place. Vietnam's cities are dense, lively, full of motion, and for years, that motion has come with exhaust. The motorbike is woven into daily life here, millions of them, and so the question of how to keep the energy of the streets while clearing the air above them is not abstract. It is personal. The details of how these zones are being drawn and enforced are still taking shape, but the direction is clear. Authorities are looking at where pollution gathers most and asking what small, deliberate changes could make the air easier to breathe. Electric vehicles are becoming more visible, not everywhere yet, not evenly, but steadily. And behind the policy there is something simpler, a recognition that the cities people love should be places they can also breathe in. If you're still with me, picture one of those streets at dusk, the lights coming on, the sound of engines just a little quieter than before, and the air a little lighter than it used to be. That, at least, is the hope taking root here. Bahrain sits at the eastern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, a small island nation whose quiet waters lie within reach of one of the world's most vital shipping lanes, the Strait of Hormuz. These days, that proximity weighs on everything. Bahrain has been working on a revised resolution concerning the strait, and there is hope that a vote could come by Friday. It is the kind of diplomatic effort that doesn't make much noise but matters enormously to the countries that depend on these waters for their daily bread. The Strait of Hormuz carries a large share of the world's oil, and any disruption there sends ripples far beyond the Gulf, Bahrain, small in size but steady in its diplomacy, has been pushing for language that reflects the concerns of the states closest to the waterway, not just the powers that project influence across it. The revision suggests a willingness to listen, to adjust, to find wording that more countries can accept. Behind this effort lies a harder reality. Recent weeks have seen tensions spill into the open, with reports of missiles and drones directed toward Gulf states, Bahrain among them. Navy families evacuated from the island have faced their own confusion in the aftermath. Uncharted territory, as one account put it, of paperwork and uncertainty. So the resolution is not abstract. It grows from lived pressure. If the vote comes Friday, it will be one small step in a long conversation about who controls these waters and who keeps them calm. For now, Bahrain waits and hopes the wording holds. Cape Verde sits out in the Atlantic, 10 islands where the wind never quite stops, and life has always moved to its own measure. These days, there's a small piece of good news settling over the archipelago. Inflation softened in July. That's a quiet thing, the kind of change you feel before you read about it. A market basket that had been climbing in price eased just a little, and for families across Santiago and São Vicente and the smaller islands, that easing matters. It means a bit more room at the end of the month, not abundance but breadth. And there's a shift on the football pitch too. Cape Verde has named a new head coach, Betancourt, stepping in for Bubista, the man who led the Blue Sharks to their World Cup breakthrough. That run was something remarkable for a nation of roughly 500,000 people, a team that played with the kind of joy and defiance that made strangers around the world pick them as their second team. Bubista gave them that. Now the baton passes, and Betancourt takes on the strange, lovely burden of carrying a small country's hopes forward. If you're still with me, picture those islands tonight, volcanic rock ringed by surf, the lights of Praia coming on as the trade winds keep the air moving. A country where prices have eased just enough to notice, and where a new coach is settling into the job of keeping a beautiful, unlikely football story alive. It's a good night to think of them, out there in the middle of the ocean, steady as ever. In Belgium, a young man who spent his working days selling cars has been legally recognized as a prince. He is 26 years old, and he is the son of the king's brother, a connection that was kept private for most of his life, until now. The details that have emerged are spare, the way these stories often are. A man going about an ordinary life, and then a door opening onto something he may have always sensed but couldn't fully name. Belgium is a country where the royal family occupies a careful, constitutional space, present in national life but not towering over it. The monarchy is a thread in the fabric rather than the whole cloth. So when a new prince appears, it's not a thunderclap. It's more like a quiet adjustment to the record, a name added to a family tree that had a gap. For the young man himself, the change is surely more than procedural. A legal recognition is also a personal one, an acknowledgement that carries weight in ways that go beyond titles. And for Belgians watching from their kitchens and their front rooms, it's the kind of story that doesn't demand much of them. No crisis, no controversy. Just a small human correction, a family making room for someone who is always there. If you're still with me, we'll move along now to the next stop on our way around the world. Chile sits tonight on the edge of an enormous proposition. A research body called CPI has put forward a figure, $300 billion, as the investment Chile would need to sustain its transition toward cleaner energy. That's a staggering sum for a country of roughly 19 million people, and it says something quiet but important about the scale of what Chile is attempting. If you're still with me, consider what Chile has been doing these past years. It has pushed hard into solar and wind, taking advantage of the extraordinary sun in the Atacama and the steady winds along its long coast. The country has set ambitious targets for cutting emissions and moving away from fossil fuels. But transitions, it turns out, are not single acts of will. They require sustained money for transmission lines, for storage, for the slow work of rebuilding an entire grid. And that's what this proposal is really about, not the beginning, but the keeping going. $300 billion is not a number anyone writes a check for. It would come from many places over many years: public funds, private investors, international partners. The proposal from CPI is less a demand than a map of the road ahead, showing where the cracks might appear if the money doesn't follow the ambition. What stays with you, though, is the steadiness of it. Chile isn't announcing a dream. It's looking at the cost of its own promise and asking, plainly, whether the country can afford to keep it. That kind of honesty has its own quiet weight as the night settles in. In Belize, the courts have long been something you had to travel to. A building in a town, a desk, a queue, a wait. For a country spread along the Caribbean coast and deep into rural interior, that distance has mattered. People who needed the law's protection sometimes found it sitting too far away to reach. These days, something is shifting. The United Nations Development Program is working with Belize to bring access to justice into the digital age. The details are still unfolding, but the idea is simple and quietly radical. Make it possible for people to find legal help, file what they need to file, and understand their rights without always having to show up in person. For a small nation, fewer than 500,000 people, this isn't about grand technology. It's about dignity. It's about the woman in a village who can't afford the bus fare to the capital, the farmer who needs a document stamped before a season turns, the family sorting out a dispute who shouldn't have to wait months just to be heard. Digital systems don't fix everything, and Belize knows that, but they can shorten the distance between a person and their rights. And in a place where the road to the courthouse might pass through 3 rivers and a rainstorm, that matters more than you'd think. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment, a screen lighting up where a long road used to be. Not the whole answer, but a beginning, steady and practical, the way good change often starts. Maldives is a country of roughly 1,200 islands scattered across the Indian Ocean, and like island nations everywhere, it carries both beauty and isolation in equal measure. These days, the government is turning to artificial intelligence to help expand mental health services. A quiet step, but a meaningful one for a place where specialist care can be hard to reach, especially on the smaller atolls far from the capital. The details are still emerging, but the direction is clear. The idea is to use technology to bridge gaps, to give people, particularly young people, a way to connect with support that geography might otherwise keep out of reach. That focus on youth matters here. The United Nations Population Fund has noted that Maldives is a young country, and that removing barriers to success for young people is central to its future. Mental health is one of those barriers, often invisible, often carried alone. So there's a certain logic to it, using new tools to tend to old human needs, reaching across water and distance to offer a conversation, a check-in, a steadying presence. It's not a replacement for human care, it's an extension of it, stretched further than hands alone could manage. And if you're still with me, picture those islands at night, the lights along the shore, the hum of the ocean, and somewhere on a quiet screen, a small doorway opening toward help. In the United States, there's a quiet accounting story making its way through the news this week, the kind that doesn't shout, but matters in the rooms where the world's books are kept. The country plans to pay $850 million toward what it owes the United Nations. The full amount outstanding is roughly $5 billion. That debt has built up over time, a combination of regular dues and peacekeeping contributions that fell behind. Paying $850 million doesn't erase the balance, but it's a meaningful step. a signal that the account is being tended to, even if slowly. The United Nations relies on member contributions to fund everything from food programs to peacekeeping missions, and when major donors fall behind, the effects ripple outward in ways that are felt far from New York. There's something steadying about a large country turning its attention to a ledger. Not dramatic, not loud, just the slow work of settling what was owed. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment, a payment moving through the systems that connect countries to one another, one obligation met among many still waiting. The remaining balance will keep its place on the books, and the conversation about it will continue. But for now, a portion is on its way, and that is worth noting before we move on. Estonia is marking 35 years since it restored its independence, a quiet milestone, but the kind that carries a long memory behind it. For much of the 20th century, this small Baltic nation lived under occupation. Soviet rule came in the 1940s, and for decades afterward, Estonia existed on maps as a republic within a larger union, its language and traditions kept alive in homes and song rather than in public life. That changed in 1991, when the Soviet Union was unraveling and Estonia, like its Baltic neighbors Latvia and Lithuania, reclaimed its sovereignty. 35 years on, the anniversary is being observed with the weight you'd expect, not just a date on a calendar, but a reckoning with how far a country has come and how carefully it holds what it regained. Estonia today is a place of forests and coastline, of digital governance and old stone towns, and the distance between those two eras, occupation and independence, is still within living memory for many who are there to see it. Anniversaries like this don't need fireworks to matter. Sometimes the most important thing a country can do is simply pause and notice that it is still itself. If you're still with me, that's the story from Estonia tonight, a small nation, 35 years on, standing in its own name. And that's the world for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow holds, rest easy. The world will keep turning slowly while you sleep, and we'll take another quiet trip around it tomorrow night. Good night.